Elijah didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the man who owed him a decade and a life. "I fed hunger," he said, "the kind you don't recognize." Richard's smile arrived without warmth. "You will pack your things." He smoothed the folded edge of the photograph with his thumb as if kindness could be taught to paper. Effective immediately. The words made the room colder. The vents breathed softly as if the house were afraid to be heard disagreeing. Emily didn't realize she had moved until she felt the scratch of Elijah's sleeve against her fingertips. "No," she said, and her voice cracked into a child's pleading and a witness's protest. "Please." Richard didn't flinch. "You will not befriend the help again. The staff are here to work, not to be your companions. I will not have this." He gestured at the toolbox, the photos, at the space where her small defiance stood like a flag. "I will not have my household turned into a story." Elijah's hands, those careful maps of old work, stayed open. "Firing me will not make your daughter less lonely. It will make her obedient," Richard said. Silence fell like dust after an explosion, soft and everywhere. Emily's ribs hurt. She didn't know where to put her anger without breaking herself. Elijah eased a breath in and let it out the way a man lets out a rope. Steady, not giving up, only giving slack. He reached into his pocket and brought out the small wooden box Emily had hidden against her chest since morning. For a moment, she thought he meant to take it back, and panic rose fast, wild, unreasonable. Instead, he turned it in his palm and pressed his thumb against the lid. It opened with that soft, faithful sigh. From the round groove, he lifted a brass circle the color of warm afternoons. A needle quivered and settled, thin as a thought. "It was waiting for this," he said, and placed the compass in her hands. She felt its weight and its nerve. The metal was cool. The glass was clear enough to see herself in it if she held it close. The needle trembled, then found its insistence again, a slim arrow pointing away from the doorway where power stood. Elijah's voice gentled. "When the house gets loud, let this be louder." Richard laughed once. "Trinkets and fairy tales. Give that back to him, Emily." She didn't move. "Elijah," Richard said, all courtesies and polish. "You're done here." Elijah nodded as if the word were a door he had known was coming. He closed the empty box and set it on the toolbox like a promise unbroken. Then he lifted the photographs and tucked them into his jacket pocket without sneaking, without apology, as if memories had rights, even in rooms like this. Victoria's smile went thin. "Security will escort you," she said. "We wouldn't want anything to go missing." "Nothing worth having ever leaves by accident," Elijah said, and the line hung in the air, soft and dangerous. Stevens appeared in the doorway, hat in his hand, discomfort plain in the set of his jaw. He looked at Elijah the way a decent man looks at decency when ordered to stand between it and the world. "Sir," he said, to Elijah, not to Richard. "It meant I'm sorry. It meant I'll be gentle. It meant I know." Emily broke then. She stepped in front of Elijah as if she could make herself wide enough to block a future. "Please," she said to her father. The word came small and enormous at once. "Don't do this. He's my friend." "Friends are chosen from your station," Richard said. "This conversation is over." Elijah bent, slow and unhurried, so his eyes were level with hers. The hallway light made his hair look like a storm finding sun again. "Your compass knows the way," he murmured, "only for her. Use it, little miss." Tears blurred the glass and the needle for a heartbeat. She wiped them away with the heel of her hand because she wanted to see precisely where the arrow pointed. It quivered, then steadied, the quiet insistence of something that doesn't care about anyone's opinion. Stevens cleared his throat. Elijah gave Emily the sort of smile a grandfather might save for a child he understands. Love without possession, hope without demand. Then he turned toward the corridor and began to walk. The house watched. Staff eyes flickered at thresholds and disappeared. In the kitchen, the clink of stacked plates faltered and stopped, silence rolling outward like a slow wave. Mr. Sterling, the head butler, stood very straight by the pantry and did not look at anyone. When Elijah passed him, their shoulders nearly touched, and something like respect changed hands invisibly. By the service door, a gust of evening blew in, damp from a sky about to make good on a gray promise. Elijah stepped onto the stone, and the air seemed to widen around him. He didn't look back until he reached the gate. Then he did, just once, a small lift of his hand, like a salute to a country he was leaving not by choice, but with intention. Emily pressed her fingers to the window pane until the cold bit her skin, as if pain could fasten him there. He went through the gate with the posture of a man who refuses to be reduced by thresholds. Richard turned away first. "Emily," he said, "you will return to your room. You will not leave it without permission. Your meals will be brought. Lessons will continue. He glanced at Mrs. Blackwood, who had come somehow without being seen arriving. See to it. Mrs. Blackwood's mouth was a small line that did not quite agree to its job. Yes, sir, she said. Victoria exhaled triumph and hooked her arm through Richard's. You did what had to be done, she murmured, polishing his choice with flattery. Emily did not answer any of them. She stood with the compass in her palm and counted the seconds between the lightning's ghost and the thunder's body. The storm was close. The ripples began before nightfall. Mr. Sterling placed a white envelope on the silver tray in the foyer. My resignation, he told the marble, because people who had served longer than most marriages know which things deserve to hear the truth. Maria from the kitchen tied her apron strings into a neat bow, laid the apron on the counter, and kissed the top of the mixer as if it were a sleeping child. James in the garden put down his shears mid-clip and stared across the lawn as if measuring the distance between pride and a paycheck. In twos and single lines, in whispers and in notes, the house lost pieces of itself that money had never truly bought. Emily watched the quiet departures with a hurt that didn't flare. It smoldered. She opened the compass again and let the needle settle. She thought of Elijah's room, the lantern glow, the knit blanket, the way he said storms were applause for staying. She thought of the wooden bird and the pressed flower and the crane with its breath made of paper. They were fragile and somehow stronger than marble. She wondered if that was the point. She ate what they brought to her that evening because not eating would only make them smug about children and drama. She answered none of Mrs. Blackwood's questions because loyalty demanded silence sometimes. When the governess closed the door, Emily counted to 500, then to 1,000, because numbers were the only thing in this house that obeyed her without complaint. The first thunder rolled across the roof like furniture dragged by a giant. Rain came hard, slanting, excited to be loud. Somewhere deep, a generator clicked to alert the systems that they were safe and special. Emily slipped into her robe and put the compass's cord around her neck. It thudded softly against her sternum, a private drum keeping time with something more stubborn than fear. She knew the route better now. She moved in the seam where shadow met light, an apprentice ghost. On the landing, she paused and watched her father's silhouette cross his study, tall, certain, alone. He didn't see her. Mirrors never showed him what mattered. At the service stairs, the air smelled of damp shoes and boiled potatoes. She went down and down until the house grew small around her. The side door stuck the way it always did, then gave with a sigh, then a wet breath. Rain found her hair and her cheeks, insistent and cold. The compass needle steadied, pointing toward a city she'd only ever driven through with tinted windows and a driver who never made eye contact. She lifted her chin the way her mother used to when wind tried to take her hat. She tucked the rabbit inside her robe, feeling its faded fur trap her warmth. She stepped out into weather that did not know her name and decided that was a good thing. The gate loomed and then was behind her, a fact, not a wall. The compass pointed left. She went left. Back in the house, a figure paused at the dark window and watched a small shape become smaller in the rain. Mrs. Blackwood's hand covered her mouth, not to hide a gasp, but to hold in a question. In the study, Richard stared at a folded photograph and heard thunder that, for once, did not sound like applause. Emily kept walking. The rain tried to push her back and failed. The city ahead glowed with the ordinary light that belongs to people who are not rich and are still alive. The needle in its little glass world never wavered. Riverside didn't shimmer like the estate. It breathed. The rain softened the brick and made the sidewalks shine like honest work. Streetlights hummed with an old, dependable glow, and a bus sighed at the curb, opening its doors for people who didn't have drivers, who carried umbrellas that remembered other storms. Emily kept to the edges, holding the compass where it thudded lightly against her chest, the needle steady as a heartbeat that refused to speed up just because the world did. She counted intersections like beads, left at the laundromat where warm steam pushed the night back, straight past the bakery that smelled like morning even when it wasn't, a right at the mural of a river that ran blue even in the rain. The compass agreed with each decision. It didn't care about puddles or the cold finding her ankles. It cared about direction, and it kept giving her one. By the time her slippers were wet through, the rain had softened to a stubborn mist. The building that matched the needle was a 4-story walk-up with a crooked mailbox panel and a front door that asked people to mean it. She meant it. The buzzer was the kind that didn't forgive. She pressed 4C because it felt right, or because the compass felt heavier when she looked at that number. Nothing happened for a breath. Then the speaker crackled and released a familiar voice. "Who's there?" "Emily," she said. "It's me." A pause, then the lock clicked with an old metal shrug. The stairwell smelled like damp coats and floor cleaner that had given up being proud. She climbed, counting steps to keep her courage awake. On the fourth floor, the hallway leaned, not in a dangerous way, in a way that said, buildings get tired too. The door to 4C was open just enough to show a strip of warm light and the edge of a wooden bench. Elijah stood inside with a towel in his hands. He took one look at her hair and the small lake forming in her shoes and made a sound that was half laugh, half worry. "You walked," he said, not asking. "Come in." His apartment was small and clear, a table that had learned to hold more than plates, a shelf of books whose spines were a history of hands, a plant in a chipped mug doing its best by a window that needed kindness. The warmth wasn't from the heater, it was from use. Things belonged because they were used. He wrapped the towel around her shoulders and rubbed until her hair sprang back into itself. "You brought the storm with you," he said. "Good, it'll keep us honest." "I followed the compass," she said. The admission sounded too simple for what it cost. He looked at the brass circle and nodded like it had made a correct introduction. "It doesn't lie," he said. "We have to decide if we will." "I won't," she said quickly, then softer. "I don't want to." He pointed her toward the radiator and a pair of wool socks that had a history. "Trade those slippers for these," he said. "Your feet will like me for it." As she sat, the room rearranged itself into a memory she hadn't had yet. The smell of his place was not the estate's polite nothing. It was cedar soap, coffee that remembered being brewed this morning, and something sweet she couldn't name. On the wall above the table, a frame held a drawing done in colored pencil. Birds with improbable wings, a small hand at the bottom practicing courage with every line. Emily recognized the way the feathers were wrong and right at once. Her drawing. He'd kept it in a place where it could see the room. "You hung it," she said, surprised joy rising like heat. "Of course I did," he said. "A house needs witnesses." A knock sounded across the hall and a door opened to voices and the drum of small feet. Elijah glanced at a clock that didn't blink numbers but held them. "We're late," he said, and his eyes warmed the way rooms should. "Thursday night is class." "What class?" "You'll see." They went back down the stairs that had decounted her breaths and out to the rain that had decided to rest. 2 blocks away, a community center shone like a story nobody believed could be true until someone told it twice. The sign was hand-painted. The inside was bright enough to improve moods. A bulletin board held flyers in earnest colors. After-school tutoring, a food drive, a chess club that promised the first lesson free because learning should be greedy only for time. At the far end of a room that cared about noise, a long table held wood shavings like curled commas. The air carried sawdust and lemon oil and the kind of attention that makes a place holy. Elijah walked straight into work, rolling up his sleeves while 3 children in oversized goggles greeted him with confidence that had nothing to do with size. A boy with a cowlick and a girl with braids fought a laugh into something productive. A teenager lifted his chin the way you do when you're trying not to show hope. On a shelf, small projects waited. Birds with eager beaks, boxes with lids that fit nearly right, a small boat that wanted water and would settle for being admired. "Mr. C," the boy announced, "we thought you'd ditch." "Impossible," Elijah said. "I promised I'd teach you dovetails, and a promise is a door we do not close." He put Emily at the end of the table, tied an apron around her that dragged like a story too long but still worth hearing, and set a scrap of pine in front of her. He placed a small block plane in her hands and showed her the angle, the pressure, the patience. The first curl of wood lifted from the board and landed on her wrist with a warmth that startled her. The shaving looked like a ribbon that had remembered it was once a tree and decided to be both. "It's like coaxing," she said, delighted. "It's exactly that," he said. "Yeah, most good things are." She watched the others. The girl with braids sighted down a ruler like a hunter. The teenager measured twice, cut once, and smiled as if a secret had just chosen him. The boy made a mistake and winced and tried to hide it. Elijah showed him how mistakes become design if you own them quickly enough. The boy grinned the way boys do when they are taught grace. "You do this every week?" Emily asked, working the plane again. Careful now, making the surface feel like an answer. "Every week," he said. "Some weeks, every day." "Do they know about—" She didn't want to say the estate. She didn't want to drag that world in here and let it take over. "They know I'm here," he said. "They know they are too. That's enough for an hour." When class ended, the kids cleaned more than they'd messed, which is how you know love is involved. They left in bursts, promises about next time caught in their breath. Elijah wiped the table with strokes that looked like prayer. Emily helped, because idle hands in a room like this felt wrong. "Why didn't you tell them?" she asked. "About before." He draped a towel over a chair back and turned the question toward the light. "We build in the direction we're facing," he said. If I stare behind me too long, I'll plane right through the good wood. You could be angry, she said, small and fierce again, because the universe deserved to hear the obvious said aloud. I have been, he said. Anger is weather. It comes, it goes. If you build with it, the roof leaks. They stepped into the night, which had learned to be quiet again. The city smelled like rain drying and street food improvising, and 1,000 apartments deciding whether to forgive each other. Emily walked beside him, matching his pace because children learn tempo from the people who keep them safe. The compass lay warm against her skin. Back at the building, they hesitated at the word. A door in the way of people who would like to postpone the moment when something ends. Elijah unlocked it and held it with his shoulder, a courtesy disguised as habit. They climbed, and the steps didn't feel so steep, maybe because the evening had made her larger inside. On the landing of the 3rd floor, a man in a ball cap stood with a clipboard and a box tucked under his arm. He glanced at Elijah, then at Emily, then settled on a neutral expression. Mr. Carter? Yes. Courier, he said, as if it were a job and not a posture. Package. Personal and confidential. Elijah frowned at the return address, which held nothing but a city and a post office box, as if secrecy were etiquette. He took the box and turned it in his hands the way a carpenter turns wood before the first cut. Thank you, he said. Signature, the man replied, and Elijah signed with the careful letters of someone who knows names are history. The courier nodded and took the stairs down with speed that belonged to youth or deadlines. They carried the box into the apartment and set it on the table Emily had mistaken for an altar. Elijah fetched a knife with a blade that had been sharpened properly and slipped it under the tape with respect. Inside lay folders bound with black clips that looked like small clamps holding down a storm. The top sheet had a header with a name Emily recognized only because the house had taught her logos the way other children learned lullabies. Whitmore Industries. Under it, a memo with language that felt cold in her mouth. Strategy, market pressure, regulatory liaison, off-the-record assurance. Elijah did not sit. He stood with one hand on the back of a chair and read until his jaw set. He skimmed dates that matched the months the factory died. He skimmed signatures that performed structure while avoiding conscience. He skimmed an email where a man wrote, "Bring Carter to the brink. He's too respected to buy. Break him instead." Another page, stamped with a date, tracked anonymous tips and inspection scheduling as if ruin were a calendar you could print and pin to a wall. Emily looked up at him. Is it bad? It's true, he said, and it landed heavier than bad ever could. Who sent it? He turned the box lid over, searching for a hint. The cardboard kept its secrets. He took the first folder and closed it, not to hide, but to keep the night from swallowing it whole. He looked at the compass at her throat, then at the window where the city performed its quiet. Back at the estate, a different doorbell sound threaded the marble. In the study, Richard looked up from the folded photograph that had weighed all evening on his desk and frowned. Stephen stepped aside to allow a second courier past the threshold, this one with a thin envelope in a waterproof sleeve. For Mr. Whitmore, the man said, by hand. Richard took it, slid it open, and slid out a sheaf of documents he knew, in the first second he should have destroyed 15 years ago. Memos, in his words, attachments bearing his initials, an old photograph he had never seen of Elijah standing with his employees on the day the factory closed, shaking each hand like a pastor at a funeral, only he refused to officiate. Across the bottom, in careful, familiar handwriting, a line he recognized from a childhood he had outgrown like a suit. A good man destroyed by a cruel one. Never forget. His father's script. Richard sat back, thunder moving through him in a silence that hurt. The room, trained to his comfort, did not offer any. He felt something unfamiliar push against the hinge of his ribs. Fear, yes, but not for assets. For a child walking somewhere in the rain without him knowing. For a truth finally knocking without asking to come in. In Riverside, Elijah put the lid back on the box and told Emily they would make tea because people who have just met a fact need something warm in their hands. She held the compass and the mug and watched the needle. It didn't waver. It never did. Will you tell my father? She asked. He met her eyes and let the quiet answer first. Your compass knows the way, he said. She nodded, understanding that this time the arrow pointed through rooms she had always lived in and through a man she had only just begun to meet. Outside, the city leaned into its own breathing. Upstairs, a pipe groaned like an old man fixing his knee. Somewhere far away and very near, a decision started to gather itself, sure as sunrise. Morning returned to the estate as if nothing had changed, as if marble could forget rain. But the house had a new sound if you knew how to hear it, the faint, restless hush of people deciding who they wanted to be. Emily woke before the light settled, the compass warm against her collarbone, a steady presence that made her feel taller inside. She dressed herself, no satin bows, no shoes that scolded floors, and tucked the wooden box into her pocket. The hallway mirrors tried to hand her back a smaller girl. She declined. Mrs. Blackwood was waiting at the end of the corridor with a tray that pretended to be breakfast and a face that had practiced neutral for years. "Good morning, Miss Emily," she said, then lowered her voice. "Come with me." They did not go to the schoolroom. They went to the governess's quarters, a rectangle of order softened by a vase of clover and a photograph of a seaside no one here had asked about. On the desk lay a laptop, 2 notebooks, and a fountain pen that gleamed with a quiet kind of pride. Mrs. Blackwood closed the door, turned the key, and placed the key on the desk between them, a small ceremony of trust. "I don't have much authority," she said, "but I have enough to help you use yours." Emily climbed into the chair, feet not reaching the floor, heart reaching everything. "I want to fix what he broke," she said. The pronoun hung in the room, understood without being named. Not just for Mr. Elijah, for the people in those photos, for the ones who never met him and should have. "Then we will need a plan," Mrs. Blackwood replied. "Plans speak a language this house respects." They began with a name. Names mattered here. They opened doors when keys were inconvenient. At the top of a blank document, Mrs. Blackwood typed in clean, generous letters, "The Emily Whitmore Foundation for Fair Work and Honest Markets." Emily read it aloud once, surprising herself with the way it steadied her mouth. She looked older when she spoke in a grammar she'd never been taught. "What will it do?" the governess asked. "Make what was taken," Emily said. "Return jobs, teach better ways, keep the big from eating the small just because they can." "Then we will need pillars," Mrs. Blackwood murmured. "Funding, governance, programs, transparency, impact." They shaped the bones together, funding first, an endowment carved from Whitmore profits that had been sharpened into weapons 15 years ago. "A clean percentage," Mrs. Blackwood advised, "large enough to mean sacrifice." Emily chose a number so big the air changed. "If it doesn't hurt," she said, "it will be pretend." Governance next. Elijah as executive director with full autonomy, a board with community voices, not only men with polished shoes and hard smiles. "Add term limits," the governess said. "Add public meetings quarterly. Add audited reports anyone can read." Emily nodded, learning that honesty likes daylight. Programs took shape like houses on a street she wanted to live on, a rescue fund for small manufacturers squeezed by predatory contracts, legal clinics that taught owners to read the traps hidden in Fin, ePrint, a supplier credit line that favored companies doing work that helped people breathe, walk, heal, training for veterans who knew how to carry weight and wanted to build again, childcare on site so parents didn't have to choose between paychecks and presents. "And we rebuild Carter Industries," Emily said, the one sentence she'd been holding like breath, not as revenge, as proof. "Put it under the foundation," Mrs. Blackwood said, fingers moving, eyes bright for the first time Emily had seen. "Let its profits feed the rescue fund. Let its books be open to scrutiny. Let its hiring start with the names Elijah still holds in his pocket." They wrote until noon, found the window, and decided to stay. The document grew from a page to a promise. Whenever a word felt showy, they replaced it with one that felt like a hand you could hold. Whenever an idea sounded like a speech, they turned it into a step you could take in work boots. At the doorway, people began appearing as if they had heard the hum of a new machine and wanted in. Maria came first, carrying a ledger she had kept for herself all these years, a list of staff charities and overtime hours she had quietly paid out of her own cash when the payroll system misplaced compassion. "If you want proof that people matter," she said, laying it on the desk, "use me." Mr. Sterling arrived in his civilian sweater, resignation already delivered, loyalty not yet exhausted. He placed a slim folder beside Maria's ledger, names and numbers from vendors who'd watched Carter vanish and would swear to what they saw if someone finally asked. James from the garden brought a clipboard that didn't belong in a garden, scrawled with the addresses of former Carter employees his cousins still knew by first name. "They thought it was their fault they lost everything," he said, throat tight. "Tell them it wasn't." Emily said thank you so many times the words broke open and grew larger. She added a page to the plan called Testimonies, not for court, for truth. She asked Mrs. Blackwood to format it like the important papers because people who had been ignored deserved the dignity of serif fonts and numbered sections. Near 2 o'clock, the phone in the corridor rang with a tone reserved for emergencies and powerful friends. It carried into the room even through the closed door. The governess picked up and listened without speaking. When she set it down, the careful face returned, but could not hide the current beneath it. That was the office, she said. Mr. Donovan is giving the board 24 hours. If your father does not explain the acquisition or announce reparations, the documents go public. Good, Emily said before Fear could finish entering. Let him hurry us. They printed the plan. The printer clicked inside and pushed it out warm and smelling like resolve. Mrs. Blackwood slid the pages into a binder and handed it to the child, who looked suddenly like a person you would follow into a burning building. You will need an ally in the room, she said, the kind who doesn't need introduction. He won't let Mr. Elijah through the door, Emily replied. Then you will open it, the governess said. You are his daughter. The car ride downtown felt shorter than guilt. Stevens drove without asking questions, eyes forward, hands steady, choosing the longer route to give the girl in the back seat 2 extra minutes to practice being brave. Emily rehearsed the first sentence in her head, the one that would either be a key or a child's plea. She held the compass under her sweater and felt the needle remind her where courage lives. The headquarters towered, steel and glass stitched together to impress men who assumed height equaled truth. Emily kept her eyes on the revolving door, the kind that will trap you if you hesitate. She didn't. The lobby swallowed her and tried to make her feel small with its echoing ceilings and the abstract art that meant nothing except money. The security desk stopped them the way moats used to stop horses. Stevens said her name, which was a password this building still respected. The guard made a call, listened, nodded, and handed over 2 visitor badges because Stevens asked for 2 and did not blink when the voice protested. In the elevator, Emily watched numbers light up like a countdown to a story's loudest chapter. At the conference floor, the doors parted to a corridor of framed victories, magazine covers, awards, a photo of her father shaking hands with someone whose smile didn't reach his eyes. She didn't look away, but she didn't slow. The boardroom doors were thick wood pretending to be democracy. Inside, voices stacked on top of one another and tried to become thunder. She pushed. The room turned toward the small sound of a small hand insisting. Her father stood at the far end, jaw set, tie perfect, a man surrounded by men who smelled like cologne that called itself success. Donovan sat near the window, a half smile that carried both threat and entertainment. Screens glowed blue on the wall, waiting for numbers to make them feel safe. No one expected a child in a navy sweater with a binder too big for her arms. Emily, her father said, the word a warning and a plea. This isn't. It is, she said, and discovered that sentences come out stronger when they arrive timed with your own breath and not someone else's. You're deciding what to do about Mr. Carter and the people like him. You don't get to decide without me. A dozen eyebrows rose. A dozen mouths prepared to explain adulthood. Donovan leaned back, amused to see what the hurricane would knock over next. Emily slid the binder out onto the table and opened it to the first page so they could read the name before they dismissed it. The letters looked steady even under fluorescent lights. Behind her, Stevens opened the second door. A man paused at the threshold and took off his cap, not as a performance, as a courtesy. His jacket was clean and didn't apologize for being old. He stood in a room where money thought it knew everything and did not make himself smaller. A few board members shifted, recognizing something they did not have words for. Mr. Carter, Emily said without turning, because she knew he would be where her voice could find him. Please come in. A dozen instincts tried to drag the moment back to the world that had kept Elijah outside. Policy, protocol, the choreography of power. The compass under her sweater tugged, a thin insistence against her skin. She held the table's edge and met her father's eyes. If you shut that door, she said, calm and fierce, you will have to lock me out too. Silence snapped tight, then stretched thin enough to hum. A dozen suits watched a 7-year-old stake a claim at the head of a table that had ended better men than this. Donovan's smile tilted, curious, like a man who realizes the weather has turned but is willing to get wet to see what it becomes. Richard's gaze flicked from his daughter to Elijah, then to the open binder. The muscles along his jaw worked, subtle as gears catching. Security, he began. No, Emily said, not louder, just steadier. The word hung in the conditioned air and did not apologize for its size. If Mr. Carter leaves, so do I. Elijah removed his cap and set it on the credenza, as if placing it there were a promise to treat this room like a place where truth might yet be spoken. He didn't touch a chair. He didn't need to sit to belong. Let's hear the child, Donovan said mildly, which in this room counted as emotion. A board member with a blue tie cleared his throat. This is highly irregular. So are subpoenas, Donovan replied, and the man decided silence suited him. Emily opened the binder to the first tab. The paper breathed a little under her hands. You want numbers, she said. You'll get them. But first, names. She slid a photograph onto the polished wood. A woman in a factory apron, smiling with the kind of pride that has nothing to do with pay stubs. Another photo. A man with oil on his knuckles and a baby on his hip. Then a page of short paragraphs written in different hands, each beginning with "When Carter closed." She did not read them all. She read 3. She read them like prayers that did not ask, only testified. When Carter closed, the first said, we sold the house my mother grew up in. We packed her humming into boxes and never heard it again. When Carter closed, the second said, my boy stopped asking for soccer cleats and started asking if we would have lights. When Carter closed, the third said, I forgot the smell of Friday. I didn't know days had sense until they didn't. The room shifted. It didn't soften. It redistributed its weight, the way a ship does when it meets a wave and decides not to capsize. Numbers were safer for these men. Names unbuttoned their armor. These are anecdotes, the CFO said, voice thin and sharp. We handle outcomes, not emotions. Emily met his eyes with a steadiness that made 2 board members look away. Outcomes happen to these people. She turned a page. Columns appeared. Clean, unflinching. Funding. 10% of Whitmore's retained earnings from the last 15 years, transferred into an irrevocable trust. Governance. An independent board with community seats and term limits. Transparency. Quarterly public meetings, audited financials posted online. Programs. Small manufacturer. Rescue fund, legal clinics, supplier credit, veteran apprenticeships, on-site childcare, deliverables, jobs restored, businesses saved, wages raised, pensions repaired. Impossible, the blue tie said. Expensive, the CFO corrected. Correct, Emily said. Good things are both. She stepped back, not to retreat but to make space for the man she'd brought. Elijah didn't take the head of the table. He stood beside the projection screen where no one had thought to project anything yet and spoke as if the walls were human. 15 years ago, he said, you ended a company that built parts for machines that help people keep their lives. You ended paychecks, mortgages, dinners. You did it with documents that said strategy and pressure and market correction. That language kept you warm while other people got cold. He paused. The room held its breath because he asked it to without asking. Today, you can do something that language doesn't have a word for in this building. You can repair. Not charity. Not absolution. Repair. Take responsibility. Build structures that outlast your press releases. Let the people who were crushed help design the machine that lifts. A director in pearl earrings frowned. And what of precedent? We cannot put ourselves in the position of paying for every competitive decision that results in someone losing a job. Elijah's eyes were kind and unyielding. You already set a precedent. You showed that a company can devastate a town from a corner office and call it weather. We're asking you to set a different one. Richard's hand found the back of a chair as if he'd forgotten what to do with his fingers. You ask as if we owe you. Elijah nodded. You do. A cough, a hiss of breath, a laugh that died too quickly. Donovan watched Richard like a poker player who has just seen a card slip and is pretending he didn't. Emily reached into her sweater and brought out the compass. The brass caught the ceiling lights and tamed them. She placed it on the table where deals were made and broke. The needle trembled and then found its north, thin and stubborn, pointing away from the windows where the city pretended not to listen. My tutor, she said, voice small only because her throat ached, taught me that true north isn't a place. The CFO let out a sound between a scoff and a sigh. Your tutor? Mr. Carter, she said, without blushing at titles. He has been teaching me how to see what matters. He can teach me business. He can teach you, too. A director leaned forward, smile tight. We can't install a janitor as an educator in this organization. Elijah didn't flinch at the word. He turned it over, examined it, and set it down. I was a janitor because your company liked me better invisible. I was a CEO before you decided visibility needed punishment. I can be both. I am both. People are more than one thing. The sentence found a seam in the room and widened it. Donovan tapped a finger on his folder, cheerful as a man at a parade of consequences he did not have to march in. If you want the market to show you mercy, he said, build the thing she just described, announce it, fund it, put him in charge. If not, I will do what I came ready to do. And what is that? Richard asked, though his eyes said he already knew. Publish, Donovan said, everything. The board murmured, a hive tasting smoke. A man who had not spoken in 10 years of meetings cleared his throat as if using an old instrument. Richard, he said quietly, we are out of clever. Emily watched her father. She knew his tells now. The way his shoulders lifted a fraction when he was about to lie, the way his mouth thinned when he counted before speaking to give himself time to choose cruelty over care. Neither happened. He looked at the compass the way a man looks at a mirror that suddenly tells the truth. Morning arrived like a held breath over the Whitmore estate. The lawn glistened with dew, each blade of grass sharp enough to slice the light. Marble columns watched the driveway without blinking. Inside, mirrors pretended to double the rooms when all they really did was double the silence. Footsteps of the staff were careful and trained, the kind that touched the floor like secrets. They appeared, completed a task, and faded again, as if the house swallowed them whole and only released them when it needed something polished, trimmed, or refolded. Emily pressed her forehead to the cold window and breathed a small circle into the glass. The fog framed the world like a picture she could never step into. 7 years old and already a student of quiet, she held a worn rabbit against her ribs. One ear flopped, the other was sewn back on with lavender thread. The perfume had faded months ago, but sometimes if she closed her eyes and inhaled until it hurt, she could pretend her mother had just left the room. Pretend was a skill here. It was how she survived the cavernous dining table, the long corridor where lights came on a fraction of a second before her steps, the way the air always felt measured and owned. Down the hall, a soft rhythmic sound slipped through the hush. Cloth on brass, pause, breath, cloth on brass. Emily knew that sound. It meant the fixtures would gleam in a way that made the chandeliers throw stars, and the stars would land on the floor like promises. She opened her door without letting it creak and peered into the corridor. He stood with his shoulders easy and his elbows neat, as if even the space around him deserved respect. Late 60s maybe, but he moved like the clock did when no one was watching. Steady, purposeful, never wasting a second. His uniform was clean and pressed, the gray softened by the careful mending that told its own story. His hands, the first thing she always noticed, were a map of old work, pale scars, a knuckle that didn't bend all the way, a nail that had regrown imperfectly and never apologized for it. He polished the brass as if the future depended on its reflection. Emily stepped out, small feet locating the safe boards that wouldn't betray her with a groan. She didn't speak. He didn't look up. The house liked it that way. She stood a few steps away and watched the cloth describe small circles, each pass revealing a warmer shine. If kindness had a sound, it was that cloth, patient and faithful, returning the shine no one else had time to see. Her rabbit slipped. It brushed her elbow, tumbled, and landed face down on the marble with a soft, humiliating thud. She gasped and reached for it on instinct, but he was already there. The movement was quick and precise, a gentleman's bow disguised as housework. He lifted the rabbit into his palm, brushed away an imagined speck, and adjusted the crooked ear with a tenderness that didn't belong to a stranger. "Looks like someone took a long journey to the floor," he said, voice warm with a grit that felt earned. "The ground's not so bad when there are good hands waiting to pick you up." Emily swallowed and nodded. "Thank you." "You're welcome, little miss." He offered the rabbit like it mattered, not like it was a thing to be returned and forgotten. The rabbit fit back into her arms as if relieved. Up close, she saw it, a small pale scar trailing from the base of his thumb to the heel of his palm. It made her think of maps and rivers. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Only when storms remember my name," he said, smiling with his eyes. "What's your name?" The question left her in a rush and made her cheeks warm. Children here were supposed to learn names from lists, not from mouths. "Elijah," he said, "Elijah Carter." Victoria arrived on a gust of scent and sound, every diamond announcing itself. Her dress was a red that knew it was being looked at. She did not approach. She arranged for them to see her and then allowed the distance to close. "Richard," she purred. "How theatrical." "Good evening, Victoria," he said. The syllables carried no invitation. She let her gaze slide to Elijah, up and down, pausing briefly as if inspecting a product she would not buy. "I do hope you're comfortable," she said. "Sometimes guests forget that novelty wears off." Elijah met her eyes with the calm of a man who has watched storms and learned not to address the thunder. "Comfort is relative," he said. "Integrity travels with its own chair." She blinked, not because she didn't understand, but because she didn't expect to be answered by a sentence that left nowhere for disdain to sit. Emily felt Richard's arms stiffen under her hand. The room tasted the tension and moved a step closer as one organism. Whispers spread like condensation on glass. A waiter cleared his throat, lifting a tray with focus that became bravery by accident. The orchestra paused, and a ripple went through the ballroom as a woman in a silver gown made her way across the floor with a cane that looked ceremonial until you saw how it helped. Mrs. Pimpton could silence a room with a glance, but tonight she used a smile. It worked faster. She stopped in front of Elijah and touched his arm the way people touch something they are grateful to see again. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I thought it was you. You haven't changed as much as time would like." Elijah's face softened. "Mrs. Pimpton," he said, warmth infusing the formal address, "it has been a long road." She looked past him to Richard, and the room arranged itself for witnessing. 30 years ago," she said, voice hushed still and somehow everywhere. "My son served with this man. When my boy did not come home, Mr. Carter brought me his things. He stayed 3 days and filled my kitchen with stories until grief learned how to breathe without choking." She turned to the crowd. "This man is a hero. If anyone has a problem with his presence, they have a problem with me." The air changed. You could feel it loosen, like a collar being unbuttoned. A judge lifted a glass. "To heroes," he said, "and others who would never have dared to be first hurried to be second." Victoria's smile sharpened to a thin blade. "How touching," she said, and the blade turned toward Emily. "And how convenient for a child who has decided she likes projects." Richard stepped, placing himself between the insult and its intended mark. He did not raise his voice. He adjusted his choices. "We're done," he said. Victoria laughed, the brittle kind. "With what? The evening? Your performance?" "With us." He took her left hand. The ring had cost a small apartment's worth of living. He slid it free, not cruel, not dramatic, simply accurate, and set it on a cocktail napkin as if returning borrowed property. Conversations around them pretended to continue and failed. "You'll regret this," she said, and for the first time the heat in her cheeks had nothing to do with lighting. "I will tell everyone you've lost your mind." "You already did," he said. "They'll just hear it without the jewelry now." For a heartbeat, the old Richard flashed, quick, cutting. A man who believed victory was a blow landed clean. Then it passed, and the man who remained stood steadier. Elijah's hand settled on his shoulder, a brief touch, an anchor thrown from a small boat that somehow held. Mrs. Pimpton cleared her throat, redirecting the room like a maestro. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I read the announcement about the foundation. I intend to contribute. We need companies that understand profit and decencies. We are not opposite roads." Richard bowed his head. It was not a trick, it was gratitude. It looked strange on him only because he had not worn it in public before. After that, people approached who had never approached before. A former Carter employee hugged Elijah with the kind of hug that adds years to both people's lives. A nurse whose hospital had once bought Carter parts pressed his hand and whispered, "We remember." A young man in a suit borrowed from an uncle said he wanted to apply for the veteran apprenticeship Elijah had not even finished writing and left his name written twice, in case one of them got lost. The ballroom pretended to be changed, but change that matters does not happen under chandeliers. It happens when rooms that look like this lose their claim on what counts. Even as congratulations formed a line, Richard's phone vibrated, a pulse against his ribs. He ignored the first insistence. The second came with a text from his CFO. The third came with urgent, which is a word phones use when they want to impersonate fate. He stepped toward a column and looked. Numbers don't lie, they just refuse to comfort. The stock was dropping fast, a cliff he recognized because he had once drawn cliffs for other people. A second message arrived. 3 contracts suspended pending clarity. A third, board emergency session requested by Ashford and 2 others. The screen, cold as a pond in winter, reflected his face and added a stranger's fatigue to it. Elijah joined him by the column, reading the storm without needing a forecast. "Weather," he said. "Headwinds," Richard replied, "and deserved." "Deserved isn't the same as inevitable," Elijah said. "What matters is what you do in it." Emily slipped between them and looked at the numbers the way children look at adult problems, with a clear eye and no appetite for pretense. "Are we going to be poor?" she asked. "Maybe less rich, Rar." Richard said. The honesty hurt him and healed something else. "Good," she said softly. "Maybe then you'll have time." He laughed once, a sound that understood both sides of the sentence. He pocketed the phone. "We should leave," he said, "not from shame, from conservation. This room will keep feeding on itself long after the food is gone." They turned to say goodbye to Mrs. Pimpton, who squeezed Elijah's hand and whispered, "Bring me a list on Monday." She kissed Emily's forehead as if blessing a night before a quest. "Keep your father pointed where he promised." Outside, the night had a clean edge, the kind that follows rain and makes the city smell forgiven. Their car found the curb the way loyalty finds people who have earned it. Stevens opened the door and did not ask where. He knew it would always be home first now. By the time the estate's gates received them, the market had closed like a trap. Emails multiplied. Words like downgrade and exposure and activist shareholders flashed across screens with the cheerless enthusiasm of sirens. A calendar alert appeared with a politeness that felt cruel. Board session, 1200 p.m. tomorrow. The subject line below it had fewer manners. Special resolution, leadership. Richard stood in his study, looking at his reflection in the window where the lawn made a black mirror. Emily came in without knocking and climbed into the chair opposite, legs tucking beneath her as if claiming space were a task she had been assigned for life. Elijah stood by the mantel, hands folded, a quiet sentinel. "I called this upon us," Richard said. "We called truth," Elijah answered. The rest was waiting. Emily reached under her sweater and lifted the compass from its cord. She walked to the desk and set it on the mahogany. The needle trembled as if it recognized the room where it would be most needed and least welcome. It settled with a stubborn grace. "For directions," she said. Richard looked at the small circle of brass and saw every decision he had ever pretended was inevitable. He saw the cliff, and the cliff he had built for others. He saw a girl who had made a map out of kindness and followed it into a city that did not know her last name. He reached, finally, and touched the glass. "Tomorrow," he said, voice low, "they will try to take what I used to be." Elijah nodded. "Then let them. Stand up with what you are now." Morning would come like judgment, swift and punctual. For the first time in years, Richard did not dread it. He feared it, which was different and cleaner. He left the compass where it was and let himself imagine walking into a room built to humiliate him and refusing to be small. The fear did not leave. It made space for purpose. Outside, wind combed the trees. Inside, something that had always been waiting took its first deep breath. The boardroom smelled like fresh coffee and old fear. Noon had a way of making decisions feel inevitable, as if the sun's highest point demanded the same from men in suits. The table shone with the kind of polish that begs for reflection and forgives none. Screens glowed, pens waited, a glass carafe sweated. The room had rehearsed this scene 1,000 times, but not this script. Richard arrived with Emily and Elijah a step behind him. He looked like a man who had finally found the right weight to carry. Emily set the compass on the table before anyone could ask who she was. The needle trembled and stilled, pointing between two directors as if reminding them that true north does not flatter. Harold Ashford leaned back in his chair in affected ease. His cufflinks flashed like small weapons. "Let's get this over with," he said, as if he were the one gifting mercy. "We have a resolution. Replace the CEO, restore confidence, return to business." He let business sit like a verdict. Rixie, Hard, did not take the head of the table. He stood at its side, close to the compass, close to his daughter's hand, close to Elijah's quiet. "Before you vote me out of a job I did badly for years," he said. "Allow me to tell you the truth in the language you prefer." He nodded to the CFO. The screen filled with charts that moved like weather maps, revenue lines that jagged, profit margins that thinned, a human cost that had never been plotted until now. Emily had insisted on the last line, and it ran across every slide. Jobs lost, pensions broken, towns dimmed, numbered, at last. "For 15 years, Richard said, I treated business like war and called the casualties efficiency. We made money by measuring only what could be deposited. We lost things we refused to count. If you want that man back, you should replace me. If you want a company that survives longer than its press releases, keep me and hold me to what I'm about to promise." Donovan smiled like a man hearing the song he requested finally find its chorus. Harold laughed once, short and clean. "Pretty speeches don't raise stock prices." "No," Richard said, "but integrity lowers risk, and risk is the only god you have worshipped longer than profit." A low murmur rolled around the table. He continued, "The foundation is not charity, it's a new machine. It invests in the stability of the markets we feed from. It keeps suppliers alive so disruptions don't eat us. It builds goodwill you cannot buy when you need it most. It trains a workforce that won't quit because they feel used, and it will be public, audited, and too honest to be comfortable." Harold rolled his eyes toward the ceiling. "You're bleeding value while you sermonize." "Value," Richard said, "is more than a price at 4 p.m. Emily slipped her small fingers over the compass, then pulled them back, leaving no prints on the glass. She looked around the table, not frightened, only tired of seeing men lose their courage in rooms with good air. Donovan slid a folder forward. "I've run my numbers," he said. "You can spite him and take a victory lap today, or you can partner with him and make money you don't have to be ashamed to spend. For once in your career, Harold, pick the larger game." The vote was called because there was no more room to avoid it. Names answered with yes or no, each syllable thudding like a gavel in a smaller court. The count climbed and teetered, and made men breathe through their noses. When the last director spoke, the tally landed with the painful grace of a near miss. Richard remained. Barely. Harold pushed away from the table so fast his chair stuttered on the floor. "You've doomed us," he spat. "Go bankrupt with your conscience. I prefer returns." "Build something that returns more than money," Emily said, not loud, but precise. He sneered, gathered his papers, and left promises of lawsuits in his wake. 2 directors followed him, shoes sharp, faces pale with the kind of anger that is just fear with better posture. The room emptied in a disorder that reminded everyone they were human after all. Richard stood with his hand on the back of a chair and let the relief pass over him without mistaking it for victory. Elijah touched his elbow, brief and steady. Emily slid the compass back toward him. "For direction," she whispered. He nodded like a soldier accepting a standard, not a talisman. For direction. The storm arrived after the survival, the way it often does. Phones broke into a chorus of dread. Headlines multiplied with the meanness of gossip dressed as news. Whitmore unravels. Child CEO. Janitor kingmaker? Clients paused contracts because caution is a respectable word for cowardice. Analysts downgraded. The stock obeyed gravity until gravity felt smug. By nightfall, Richard's study had gone dim even with the lamps on. Numbers stared at him from screens with an indifference that used to comfort him. A bottle of whiskey waited, patient and sure of its purpose. He poured out of habit, not desire, and stared at the amber as if it could explain anything worth hearing. The photo of Sarah, the one taken on a windy beach when they were almost kind, leaned against a stack of documents. Her hair was a riot the camera had loved. He touched the frame. "You wouldn't like the man I've been," he said. The admission scraped him raw. "But you might like where I'm trying to go." He drank. It burned. The burning felt like penance until it felt like avoidance. He set the glass down, then picked it up again, because that is how weakness works. Polite at first, then entitled. Emily found him like that, elbows on the desk, head bowed, the room smelling like oak and regret. She crossed the carpet without a sound and climbed into his lap the way she had when she was smaller and he was less absent. He startled, then steadied, then wrapped his arms around her because some instincts survive neglect. "Are we going to lose the house?" she asked. "Maybe not the house," he said, "but pieces of the life we built around it." "Good," she said, soft and absolutely certain. "Some of those pieces hurt." He exhaled a laugh that broke in the middle. Tears came sudden and without drama, as if a valve had finally obeyed. He pressed his face to her hair and cried for everything. Men he had ruined, rooms he had emptied of love, years he had spent counting only the wrong things. Emily held still, the way children do when they realize their stillness is the only steady ground an adult has. Elijah appeared in the doorway and took in the scene without embarrassment or surprise. He gathered the glass and the bottle and removed them the way a man removes a hazard from a work site, quietly, competently, without commentary that would dent dignity. He returned with water. He placed it on the desk within reach and said nothing until silence became breathable. "Tomorrow," he said, "we plant." "In what?" Richard asked, voice wrecked but honest. "Cinders?" "In soil that's been waiting for work," Elijah said. "The front lawn can spare a corner." Morning arrived with dirt under its nails. They met at the eastern edge of the estate where ornamental hedges had stood like soldiers too well paid to be useful. James had left, but his tools had not forgotten how to be held. Elijah brought a flat of seedlings from Riverside, tomatoes, basil, collards, a stubborn row of marigolds. Emily wore rubber boots that used to be red. Richard wore a shirt that didn't mind sweat. They dug. The earth gave, then resisted, then gave again, like a truth finally told. Elijah showed Emily how to cradle a root ball, how to talk to fragile things with her hands. He handed Richard a spade and said, "Depth is everything. Too shallow and it burns. Too deep and it rots." "Story of my life," Richard said, and earned a smile. Neighbors slowed at the fence as if expensive property performing humility might break, and they didn't want to miss the moment. A delivery truck passed and honked twice, not impatient, approving. The sun came out in a mood to forgive. By noon, a neat rectangle of soil grinned back at them, black and wet and honest, dotted with green that believed in the future. Emily pressed her palms to the dirt and then to her cheeks, leaving smudges like war paint. "It looks like a promise," she said. "It is," Elijah replied. "Now you water and wait." Richard looked at his hands, at the dirt under nails that had only ever known polish. He felt foolish and right at the same time, which is almost always how change first feels. His phone vibrated in his pocket with an insistence that did not care about marigolds. He ignored it for 3 rings and then answered because responsibility is not a mood. Mr. Whitmore, his general counsel said, voice clipped, all business. We received notice from the district attorney. They're opening a formal inquiry into the Carter acquisition. Fraud, market manipulation, bribery. There will be a hearing. Subpoenas are being prepared. Richard closed his eyes. When? Soon, very soon. A pause softened the edges. We'll fight. No, he said, surprising himself with the speed of the answer. We'll tell the truth and accept what comes. He hung up and looked at the garden that was not yet a garden, only faith arranged in rows. Emily stood and brushed soil from her knees. What happened? They're going to ask me to answer for what I did, he said. She nodded, as if that were the only reasonable thing a city could do. She walked to him and slid the compass from around her neck. She placed it in his palm, then closed his fingers over it. The metal warmed quickly, as if remembering its task. The needle found what it always finds. For direction, she said. He squeezed her hand with the same grip he used at the table yesterday when he chose a harder road. Elijah rested a hand on his shoulder, a weight that neither pressed nor let him float. Breaking points, Elijah said quietly, are where structures fail and people begin. They stood there, 3 bodies in a crooked line against the estate's clean geometry, watching water sink into soil and naming it the only future worth buying. Behind them, the house waited for orders. In front of them, seedlings made their silent demands: light, water, patience, courage, the W's. In moved through the hedges, the way a jury murmurs before it is called to rise. When the courier arrived with the subpoena, Stevens took it at the gate. He did not argue. He walked it in with the same care he used to carry crystal, then placed it on the study desk where the compass lay. The paper and the brass shared the wood, one cold, one warm, both relentless. Richard looked at the seal, at the date, at his name. I'll be there, he said, to the room, to the past, to the people in the photographs. He could not stop seeing. The hearing date stared back, black on white, simple as a commandment. Soon. The courthouse steps heaved with sound, cameras breathing, microphones craning, voices sharpening into questions that wanted blood. Stevens opened a path that didn't exist a minute ago, and they walked through it together. Richard in a suit that fit like consequence, Elijah with the steady gait of a man who refuses to let a room decide his worth, and Emily between them, hand in each of theirs, the compass warm beneath her collar like a small, beating truth. Inside, the courtroom smelled of paper and polish and the kind of anticipation that turns air heavy. Wood gleamed, benches murmured, reporters filled the back rows like patient wolves. Harold Ashford sat near the aisle, his expression arranged into grief for a company he'd tried to steal. Donovan occupied a corner with the relaxed posture of a man who can swim in any storm. All rise, the bailiff called, and they did. Judge Patricia Coleman took the bench with a calm that didn't need volume. She had the presence of someone who has seen men lie beautifully and does not intend to be flattered by it. She read the docket. The charges sounded brittle and official: fraud, market manipulation, conspiracy, bribery, words that had never looked Richard in the eye before. Mr. Whitmore, she said, voice even, how do you plead? Richard didn't glance at his lawyers. He did not fidget with his tie. Guilty, tie of what I did, he said. Guilty of choosing profit over people. Guilty of building my success on another man's ruin. He paused, not to manufacture drama but to gather breath without borrowing courage he hadn't earned. As to specific criminal counts, I will tell the truth as best as memory and record allow. A murmur rippled. The prosecutor, crisp and precise, approached like a scalpel. Isn't it true, Mr. Whitmore, that you arranged for inspectors to visit Carter Industries after receiving anonymous tips your office generated? Yes. And that you pressured suppliers to withdraw credit from Carter while offering favorable terms if they abandoned him? Yes. And that you disseminated false concerns about product safety? His voice did not break. Yes. Why? Because I could, he said. The answer landed like a door closing. Because I believed winning excused anything required to win. The prosecutor pivoted to Elijah. Mr. Carter, please take the stand. Elijah swore in, the oath fitting his mouth like something he had already promised himself years before. Tell the court how Mr. Whitmore's actions impacted you. We lost everything, Elijah said simply. Jobs, homes, a community's rhythm. I watched strong men forget how to stand and proud women learn to ration hope. I held too many hands while they asked me why I couldn't stop a storm I didn't see until it was on us. Do you seek punishment? The prosecutor asked. The question sharpened for headlines. I seek repair, Elijah replied. Punishment looks backward. Repair faces forward without lying about the past. The gallery shifted again, uncomfortable with mercy that didn't blink. The prosecutor frowned. Are you suggesting we ignore criminal conduct? I'm suggesting we build something stronger than a headline, he said. Hold him accountable, yes, but make the accountability fit the heart. Judge Coleman watched, expression unreadable, then turned to Richard's counsel. Any character witnesses? We have one, the lawyer said, uncertain. He glanced at Emily as if asking permission to believe what a child might do next. Emily rose before anyone could stop her. The courtroom's hush bent toward her like grass to wind. She was small beneath the ceiling, but the room did not shrink her. Your Honor, she said, careful and clear, I asked Mr. Carter to come back when my father told me not to speak to him. I brought him to my father's board. I wrote a plan to fix what my father broke. I'm 7. She swallowed, then steadied. But I know the difference between punishment and repair. Punishment makes adults feel righteous. Repair makes families whole. Ashford snorted. This is a circus. Judge Coleman's gavel didn't shout. It tapped once and the room obeyed. Mr. Ashford, you are not counsel. Emily continued, hands folded so they wouldn't betray how fast her heart ran. I'm not asking you to forgive my father because he's my father. I'm asking you to make him fix what he broke until fixing becomes who he is. The judge considered her for a long beat, then nodded to the bailiff. We'll take a brief recess. She stood. Counsel, Chambers. In the paneled quiet of Chambers, Judge Coleman did something unusual. She held up a thick, sealed envelope. This was delivered to my clerk 2 days ago, she said. It came from the law office that handled the estate of a Mr. Arthur Whitmore, your late father. Richard's breath shortened without permission. The seal tore cleanly. The judge slid out neatly bound pages and a photograph. Elijah at the factory gate on closing day, shaking the hand of a man who couldn't meet his eye. Across the bottom, a line in a careful older hand. A good man destroyed by a cruel one. Never forget. There were more pages, memos Richard had once ordered destroyed, but his father had quietly archived. A ledger of donations. A copy of a small scholarship grant issued years ago to Carter Industries, anonymous at the time, used to hire 3 returning veterans into the machine shop. Your father kept these, Judge Coleman said. He asked that if this day ever came, they be presented to the court. Richard stared at the handwriting he had learned from birthday cards and report card signatures. He felt the old, complicated love rise, the admiration that had curdled into defiance, the hunger for approval that had turned into appetite for victory. He knew, Richard whispered. He knew and said nothing. He said something, the judge replied, voice gentler than the robe allowed. He preserved the truth. He funded good work in secret. And in this letter, she lifted one last sheet, he wrote, if my son ever faces the damage he's done, help him choose repair. He is not lost. He is only late. In the courtroom again, the air felt changed, as if someone had opened a window that was never meant to open. Judge Coleman returned to the bench, and the room found its feet. This court has seen men attempt to purchase absolution, she began. We have also seen pride masquerade as principle. Today we have heard confession without excuse and mercy without blindness. She turned to Richard. You destroyed livelihoods. You manipulated systems and called it strategy. You treated people as variables. Then to Elijah. And you, Mr. Carter, have refused to confuse grace with weakness. Her gaze swept the room. The statute of limitations bars some counts. Others do not. I could pursue a prison term that would satisfy the thirst for punishment and leave a city no better than it arrived. Or I can bind you to the repair you've already begun. She read the order. 1. Full restitution to former Carter employees for lost pension contributions with interest to be administered by an independent fiduciary. 2. The immediate establishment of the Emily Whitmore Foundation for Fair Work and Honest Markets, funded with 10% of Whitmore retained earnings from the past 15 years in an irrevocable trust, with Mr. Elijah Carter as executive director and full operational autonomy. 3. The rebuilding of Carter Industries under the Foundation's umbrella, with transparent books, fair wage guarantees, on-site childcare, and first-round hiring priority to previous employees on record. 4. 1,000 hours of community service by Mr. Whitmore, specifically teaching business ethics at local colleges and community centers, with curriculum publicly posted. 5. Quarterly public reports to this court for 2 years. A breath moved through the gallery like a tide making up its mind. Some faces stiffened, cheated of spectacle. Others softened, surprised by the strange relief of justice that intends to heal. Ashford surged halfway to his feet. This is leniency dressed as virtue. It is accountability dressed as work, the judge said. Sit down. Richard did not sit. He turned to Elijah first. I can't earn your forgiveness. You don't have to, Elijah said, standing. You have to keep your promises. He turned to Emily then, and the room lost focus around her the way a camera yields to what matters. You led me here, he said. You walked, she answered, and took his hand. Outside, the cameras inhaled again. Reporters shouted questions meant to slice. Elijah stepped forward before Richard could. 15 years ago, Mr. Whitmore destroyed my company, he said. Today, the court required him to rebuild it. We're going to work. He didn't sell the moment. He refused to make it smaller than it was. Richard faced T. He microphones without a script. I built an empire on other people's ruins, he said. I'm going to spend what I have left. Money, time, pride, making something worthy of the people I broke. A reporter asked about cost. He did not blink. It will cost me most of my fortune, he said. That is the bill. I am paying it. 6 months later, morning found the old factory unrecognizable. Solar panels flashed sunlight like shields. Windows, once filmed with dust, looked back at the sky clear-eyed. A bright sign read, Carter Industries, rebuilt. Beneath it, a second line in smaller letters, a foundation company. The parking lot filled with cars that had carried the same people here 15 years before, older now, not defeated. A brass band, small, imperfect, joyful, tuned up near the loading dock. Children chased each other between neat rows of native shrubs. In the east wing, behind glass, a childcare center buzzed with blocks and crayons, and the kind of laughter buildings remember. On a small stage, Elijah stood behind a podium that didn't quite know what to do with his certainty. He didn't speak long. He didn't need to. Let's get back to work, he said, and the cheer that rose had a thickness to it. The sound of grief finally asked to sit and rest. Richard didn't take the microphone. He stood to the side with Emily, which was exactly where he belonged. Former employees passed him. Some nodded, a few embraced him with the complicated care you give to people who have changed late but real. He didn't argue with the ones who passed without looking. He understood that repair has a patience clause. Look, Emily whispered, tugging his sleeve. Through the childcare window, a circle of toddlers tried clapping to a song they barely knew, their timing gloriously off, their joy exact. This, she said. He followed her finger and felt the ache that had fueled him convert finally into something like peace. He reached for the compass she held and cupped it with her. The needle quivered, then steadied, as if even instruments understood when a destination had been earned. They walked to the edge of the new garden where marigolds kept watch like cheerful sentries. Elijah joined them, sleeves rolled, a smear of machine oil on one wrist like a signature from another life. He placed a sapling in the soil, a young magnolia, roots wrapped in burlap, leaves glossy as a promise. Foundations before facades, he said, handing Richard the spade. Together they dug. Emily pressed earth around the trunk with careful hands. A breeze lifted the leaves and made them whisper even though the day was almost windless. People gathered, not to pose but to help, then to watch, then to remember. Richard spoke without raising his voice. My father left a letter, he said, the words more for himself than the crowd. He said I wasn't lost. I was late. He placed the last scoop of soil, patted it down, and looked at the two people who had refused to let lateness become an alibi. I'm here. Elijah rested a palm against the new tree's slender bark, the way you greet an old friend you've only just met. Emily set the compass at the base for a moment, letting the brass catch the sun, then lifted it again as if not quite ready to let it out of her care. She slipped its cord over Richard's head. Keep it, she said. You know the way now. The band found its tune. Machines inside the factory woke with a sound that didn't threaten. It promised. The magnolia leaves flashed and stilled, and in the brief hush the world makes when something true happens, the three of them stood in a line, no longer predator and prey, not savior and saved, just a man learning, a man building, and a child who had pointed and forth and watched grown-ups follow. In the end, nothing miraculous had occurred. No lightning split the sky to crown them with virtue. What happened was smaller and stronger. A family formed, not by blood or contract, but by work and choice. A company reopened, not to boast, but to serve. A city watched and let itself believe, a little, that repair can outlast ruin if people keep showing up. Ready? Elijah asked. Richard nodded. For the first time, he said, and meant it. They walked toward the doors as workers filed in and the day began, real, imperfect, ordinary in the way only hard-won good things are. The compass lay against Richard's chest, steady as breath. Behind them, the magnolia held its place in the earth. Roots learning the dark as the leaves learned the light, foundation and facade, both cared for at last. She repeated it silently, filing it beside words she wished the house would say out loud. Please, thank you, stay. He returned to the brass, but slower now, as if he'd made room for her in the rhythm. Emily moved a fraction closer. The chandelier above them caught a ribbon of mourning and spun it into something gentle. She thought of the way her mother used to hum before words. Elijah worked with that same hum, body quiet, hands sure, a man more present than the portraits that lined the walls. Why do you clean it like that? She asked. They'll just tell you to do it again tomorrow. He considered, then gave her an answer shaped to fit a child and large enough to grow with her. Tomorrow will come whether I care or not. Might as well meet it with something I'm proud of. The sentence settled into the air like a truth the marble couldn't deny. Do you ever get tired? She asked. All the time, he said, not pretending. But tired isn't the enemy. Not caring is. Her fingers found a loose thread on the rabbit's belly. She pinched it and stopped herself from pulling. I like the way you make the light look different, she said, almost apologizing for speaking. When you finish, the shadows aren't as mean. He let out a soft sound that might have been a laugh. Shadows behave better when someone tends the light. She nodded as if she had always known it. The house seemed to breathe differently, less museum, more possibility. A draft found the hem of her nightgown and lifted it like a question. The question answered itself with a sound that didn't belong to light or cloth. A measured click, then another, then a line of them in a straight, unbroken march. Shoes, hard leather on harder stone. The rhythm of authority. It came from around the corner with the precision of a clock striking the hour. Elijah put down the cloth and straightened, not stiff or afraid, simply ready. Eiley took a step closer to him before she realized she had moved. The corridor collected itself. Mirrors brightened in anticipation. Even the dust, if there had been any, would have arranged its specks into a neat, obedient row. The shoes reached the turn and entered the light. The figure behind them was tall, pressed, and exact. The air tilted. Emily felt the old training pull at her spine, the one that told her to stand still, chin level, voice small. She held the rabbit tighter. Elijah did not move his hands, but something in his face settled into a quiet that looked like armor. The shadow arrived first, sharp enough to slice across the polished floor. It spilled toward them and swallowed the bright patch they had made together. The click of the next step landed inside that darkness, and the house, cold, vast, and practiced, seemed to lean in to listen. Night taught Emily the house in ways daylight never could. After lights out, the mansion shed its manners and showed her where it creaked, where it whispered, where it pretended to sleep. She learned every safe board between her room and the service corridor, the breath of the old vents, the timing of the guard's boredom. She memorized the path like a secret prayer. 4 soft steps to the landing, right hand on the cool banister, left shoulder to the wall at the portrait of the woman with pearls, pause by the window where the moon cut the floor into neat rectangles, then down the back stairs that smelled faintly of onions and steel. She waited until the glow under her door fell to a thin ribbon. Mrs. Blackwood had tucked her in with a story told in a careful, professional voice and the scent of tea that promised sleep. The governess's shoes clicked away, then fell silent behind a closed door. Emily listened for the small, soft thud of the pill bottle in the nightstand. It came. The house agreed to be hers. She slipped from the bed and into her robe, slid her feet into slippers that did not dare make a sound, and cradled the bundle she had folded in the dark. Half a honey roll, a slice of roast chicken rescued from the edge of her plate, and 2 strawberries hidden beneath a napkin printed with golden vines. She held it like she would hold a bird, gently, firmly, with the understanding that freedom was the point. The service hall accepted her with a draft and dim bulbs. She moved in the seam where shadow met light. The kitchen was a hum of sleeping steel. Pots hung like moons. The refrigerator whispered to itself. On the table sat a bowl of lemons, fat and shining, the kind of beauty nobody praised because it was busy being useful. Emily pressed her palm to one, felt its cool grain, and kept moving. She found the spot at the far end of the corridor where a thin window overlooked the side lawn, and the night kept its promise to be kind. She placed the food on the sill and folded the napkin into a little tent to shield it from curious eyes. Then she stepped back into the pocket of shadow and waited, chest tight in a way that hurt and felt good at the same time. Elijah came around the corner with his broom in that unhurried rhythm that made even sweeping look like care. He glanced to the sill, then to the shadows. He did not pretend surprise. He nodded once in the direction where she hid, a gentle acknowledgement that said, I see you, and I will not say your name aloud if you do not wish it. He lifted the bundle, sniffed the strawberries with the reverence of a man who understands small sweetness, and tucked the napkin away like a promise to return it. The next night, she left 2 wedges of cheese and 3 crackers she had counted out one by one. In the morning, under the window, she found a tiny bird carved from a sliver of wood, its beak slightly crooked, its wings spread, as if it were ready to leave and hadn't yet learned how. She carried it back to her room like treasure and kept it in a shoebox under the bed, where she hid the things that mattered. Then came the flower, pressed between 2 squares of clear tape, a purple petal still stubborn about its color. And after that, a crane folded from a page of the morning newspaper, its wings creased with such care that when she tilted it toward the light, it seemed to breathe. She placed each gift beside the bird, arranging them the way a child arranges her heart when no one is watching. Their conversations began without being called conversations. He would straighten a picture frame, and she would notice the way he checked the level by feel rather than by tool. She would ask if he could tell when something was right without measuring, and he would say, "The eye learns to listen when you make it practice." She would tell him that the big table made food taste like nothing, and he would tell her to eat with her fingers once in a while, even if it was only one bite, because the skin knew things the silver fork would never understand. Each sentence was a stepping stone across a wide stream that neither of them rushed. On the night the storm found the house, the sky warned them first. The air thickened and tasted like metal. Curtains sighed without being touched. The chandeliers became nervous and flickered like thoughts. When the thunder finally arrived, it did not knock. It slammed its whole body against the mansion and rattled the frames until people in portraits seemed to hold their breath. The lights surrendered. The hum of machines went away in a single breath, and the house became the kind of dark that makes other darknesses come closer. Emily sat up, rabbit pinned to her chest, and told herself she was brave. She was right until the next thunder tore the sky and a branch scraped the window like a fingernail. The bed felt too large. The room felt too empty. The air felt like a hallway with no door at the end. Her feet found the floor before she made a plan. The robe found her shoulders. The rabbit came without being asked. She moved through the darkness led by memory, the storm pounding a drum above her head. She found the service hall by smell and the steady, obedient pulse of the emergency lights that glowed like patient eyes. Elijah's door was ajar. Inside, a small lantern made a circle of warm honey on the floor and lifted the shadows up the walls like soft mountains. Elijah sat on a straight-back chair with a book open in his hands and his glasses low on his nose. The room was not larger than her closet, but it was full of something the big rooms never kept: attention. He stood when he saw her. "Little miss," he said, setting the book aside. "You came through a storm to the right address." "I was brave," she said, then whispered, "until I wasn't." "That's how bravery operates most days," he said. "It shows up, it shakes, it keeps walking." He placed a knitted blanket across her shoulders, the yarn smelling faintly of cedar and soap, and poured water into a tin cup that had dents like dimples. He did not ask why she was not in her bed. He knew. The lantern cracked the dark into soft pieces. Outside, the wind dragged tree branches over stone with a sound like an old broom. "Do you know what thunder is?" he asked. "A monster," she said, half teasing and half not. "A big applause," he said, voice low and certain. The sky clapping for the earth because the earth took another hit and stayed. She smiled because it fit and because it made the next thunder less sharp. He told her about summers that smelled like gumbo and river water, nights when fireflies were the only lamps a boy needed to find his way home. He pointed to the lantern and said, "Light is a promise as much as a tool," he pointed to the broom in the corner and said, "Everything worth keeping needs tending." He pointed to the rabbit and said, "The things we hold us back." She looked up. "You mean, hold us up?" "I mean both," he said, eyes kind. "Sometimes the same thing can save and slow. We learn which one it is by living." She sat a little taller under the blanket. The storm continued to announce itself, but she trusted it now. In the glow, Elijah's scar looked like a road on a map leading somewhere that still mattered. When the lights returned, they did it shyly, one sighing room at a time. The mansion exhaled and remembered it was expensive. Emily blinked and felt the loss of the lantern's gentleness more than she expected. She slid off the chair and handed the blanket back, folding it in the clumsy, careful way children do when the folding is a thank you. "Back to bed," Elijah said softly. "Storm's done its work." "What work was that?" "Reminding us we're small and strong at once." She nodded like it was a lesson with a test she wanted to pass. She stepped into the corridor and turned to go, then stopped. A shadow moved at the far end of the hall. Not a storm shadow, a person. Mrs. Blackwood stood between two polite sconces, her profile a neat silhouette, her hands folded in front of her. She did not speak. She did not step forward. She looked at the child walking out of the janitor's room, then at the janitor, then at the lantern. Her expression was complicated in a way Emily could not yet read. Emily froze, heart rattling. Elijah remained in the doorway, neither stepping out to shield her, nor stepping back to disappear. He simply waited, calm as a clock. Mrs. Blackwood inclined her head, a gesture so small it could have been a trick of the light, and then she turned and melted into the house she served. Emily did not breathe until she reached her room. Morning arrived with the smell of toast and a sky that had washed its face. Emily dressed with careful hands and went to her window to see if the storm had carried anything away. On the sill, where dew collected like pearls, sat a small wooden box. It fit her palm and had edges smoothed by slow work. Her initials were carved into the lid with a patience that made the letters right even when they were not perfect. She glanced down the lawn toward the service path. No one lingered there. The house was awake and pretending not to notice the girl who had found a gift where gifts were not allowed. She lifted the lid. The hinge sighed. The hinge sighed, and the lid lifted like a secret choosing to be heard. Inside there was no treasure, not the kind the house would recognize. It held a small groove carved into the lining, the shape of a circle as neat as a coin silhouette. A folded scrap of paper rested there, warm from the wood's breath. Emily unfolded it with fingers that tried not to shake. For safekeeping, the note read, the letters careful and steady. Some things deserve a home before they arrive. She traced the round groove with her fingertip and felt a promise she could not yet name. The box snapped shut with a soft, satisfied click. She pressed it to her chest and for a moment imagined a world where every empty space meant something good was on the way. By afternoon, the house was bright and busy, the way it gets when important people are expected. Fresh flowers arrived in buckets and were arranged into disciplined beauty. Silver was inspected under the window light. Crystal chimed softly as it was placed on starched cloth. The estate inhaled anticipatory air, and the walls straightened their backs. Emily took her lesson books to the landing above the study where the banister was smooth from years of hands, and the air smelled faintly of leather and citra. U.S. polish. It was her favorite eavesdropping place, a high perch where the house forgot to hide its voice. Below, the study door stood open just enough for voices to slip out. Her father's tone had that coolness that meant he was enjoying himself. It's not luck, Marcus. It's strategy. You bring a competitor to the edge and let gravity do the rest. Another voice, older, amused but not kind. You didn't just bring him to the edge, Richard. You built the cliff. Emily's stomach pulled tight. She knew the name he would say before he said it, the way a child knows a bad dream's next shape. Carter Industries, her father said, and the syllables landed like stones. They were leaking money. I applied pressure where it would be felt. Regulators, suppliers, rumors. Weak things break when you push them right. She did not understand all the words, but she understood the pride. She understood the way the house seemed to lean toward that room, like it always leaned toward him. She thought of Elijah's hands and a scar shaped like a riverbed. Her rabbit felt heavier in her lap. People lost their jobs, the other man said. I heard it in numbers and in the way that town went quiet. Collateral, her father said. Business isn't polite. A tiny sound escaped Emily without her permission, a breath that forgot to whisper. She clamped her hand over her mouth. Below, a chair scraped. The study door moved 2 inches toward closed and then stopped, as if the conversation wanted to keep tempting the air. Emily fled, legs small and swift, books pressed to her ribs. She took the back stairs and the quicker shadows to the service wing, the place that had begun to feel like a country with a kinder flag. Elijah was there, kneeling beside a toolbox, sorting wrenches by feel rather than by labels because he knew their weight by heart. She held the wooden box as if it could steady her. My father said your company. She didn't know how to finish without breaking something she couldn't fix. Elijah sat back on his heels and looked at her, not around her, not through her, but at her, as if her small question deserved a large answer. He wiped his hands with a cloth that had earned its stains, then rested his forearms on his knees in a posture that said he had time. They called it Carter Industries, he said. I called it keeping a promise. We made parts for machines that helped people breathe and walk and come home. It started in a garage where the summer heat tried to cook us, and ended in a factory where winter stayed outside because we said so. Why aren't you there? Her voice trembled. Why are you here? His eyes were steady. Because someone stronger on paper decided I was in his way, and because paper can be cruel when people forget it measures lives as well as profits. Her fingers tightened around the box. Did he hurt you? She glanced at his hands. Are the scars from that? He turned his palm so the light could tell the truth. Some are from work, some are from war, some are from holding on when I should have let go. They all belong to me. That's the only part that matters now. You were a soldier? She whispered it, as if the word itself should stand straighter. Staff sergeant, he said softly. A long time ago, I learned to carry weight that wasn't mine and to put it down when it was safe. The second lesson took longer. She wanted proof, not because she doubted him, but because the house had taught her that proof is the only language important people listen to. He understood before she asked. He reached into the toolbox and pulled out a worn envelope, its corners soft with years. He slid a photograph into the light. Elijah stood in a uniform that made his spine look like a lasso. And the world hadn't managed to bend. Metals winked, but his eyes were the brightest part of the picture. Young, sure, the kind that believes decency can win if it gets a fair start. Around him stood men with the same eyes. It made Emily ache in a place behind her ribs. He handed her another photo, this one glossy with pride rather than ceremony. A group of workers, women and men, sleeves rolled, smiles real, clustered in front of a brick building with Carter Industries painted across it in white that had seen both sun and rain. Children stood at the edges, grinning like this was the place their futures were being assembled. Elijah was in the middle, tie a little crooked, hand resting on the shoulder of a man who looked at him as if leadership could be a kind of love. Family, Emily said, because it was the only word that could hold the faces. He nodded. The kind you build when the world tries to take yours. She held the photo like a relic, careful not to smudge the corner where a little girl's braids caught the light. She couldn't make herself say it. Was my father the one who... Elijah did not save her from the word. Yes. She exhaled like a balloon someone let go of and watched the ceiling until the room stopped wobbling. Why don't you hate me? She asked, small and fierce at once. His mouth tilted into a tired smile. You didn't do it. But I'm his. You're yours, he said. And you came with bread in your hands. She felt heat sting her eyes and blinked it back because crying made the house nervous. She slid the soldier photo toward the box, then thought better of it and held it tighter, because some things needed to be felt before they could be kept safe. A sound gathered itself in the corridor, that measured click, the sermon of shoe leather. Emily knew the rhythm now. It carried a chill the vents couldn't explain. Elijah's shoulders didn't rise. He didn't hide the photos. He only stood, not as a man called to attention, but as a man refusing to shrink. The door swung wide with a practiced push. Her father filled the space the way he always did, as if rooms were a set he had paid for. At his shoulder, Victoria glided, scent first, eyes cold and pleased. For a heartbeat, nobody spoke. The house seemed to enjoy the pause. Emily's fingers tightened on the photograph until the paper bowed. Her rabbit lay forgotten on the toolbox, ear to the wood as if listening. Victoria's gaze dropped to the picture in Emily's hand and sharpened. What, her father said, calm and dangerous, are you doing down here? Emily couldn't make her mouth work. The answer wouldn't form. Elijah took half a step forward, not to hide her, not to offer himself, but to stand beside her because standing alone is something you should never let a child do if you can help it. We were talking, he said, voice even. The storm last night left questions. About what? Victoria's words were brittle. Proper bedtimes for children? Or are we discussing company history with the help now? Emily lifted the photo because it felt heavier than her arms could bear if she kept it hidden. The soldier in the frame looked braver than she felt. The factory crowd looked kinder than the room did. Her father's eyes dropped to the picture, and then to Elijah, and then to Emily again, and something changed in his face. Not softer, but sharper, like a blade deciding where to cut. Give that to me, he said, palm open. Emily did not move. The wooden box thudded in her chest where her heart should have been. She could hear the faintest echo of Elijah's earlier sentence. You're yours. She wanted it to be true. Now, he said. The room held its breath. The chandelier in the main hall threw a stray glint into the doorway that did not quite reach them. Elijah's hand lifted and lowered, the barest gesture, not telling her what to do, only reminding her that choosing is how people become who they are. She looked from her father's hand to Elijah's face, then down at the photograph. The paper trembled. She could smell her father's cologne and the faint oil of the toolbox. She could hear Victoria's nails tap once against the doorframe, the sound of someone enjoying hunger. Emily stepped back instead of forward. It was 2 inches, maybe 3. It felt like a country's border crossing. Her father's jaw tightened. Enough, he said, and his voice turned the air to glass. He took a single stride toward her, the room shrinking around his intention. The photo shook in her grip. Elijah's shadow joined hers on the floor, longer now, the two shapes merging before the next step fell. The room broke like a sheet of ice under a heavy boot. Her father's hand closed over the photograph, not snatching but taking, the way a judge takes a verdict he has already decided. He didn't tear it. He didn't need to. The careful fold he pressed along its center felt worse, like turning a life into paperwork. Go to your room, he said, not looking at Emily. Now. The word was iron. Emily's feet held their ground because her heart did. Her fingers found the edge of the wooden box and pressed so hard the lid bit her palm. Elijah shifted just enough to stand at her shoulder, the smallest rearrangement of space that said more than speeches. Richard Whitmore's gaze slid to Elijah. You will not speak to my daughter without my permission. You will not stand in my service wing as if it were a public square. You will not. Sir, Elijah said, quiet and even. She came with questions. I answered. You answered nothing, Victoria cut in, her voice bright with victory. You fed fantasy to a child and nostalgia to yourself. He reached for it. His fingers hovered above the glass and did not touch. He slid his hand instead to the binder and turned to the funding page. He read the number she and Mrs. Blackwood had chosen, the number that took breath to say. He exhaled through his nose like someone who has been holding something heavy for too long. All right, he said. The word made a sound inside him she felt in her own ribs, a dull crack that might have been a wall admitting it was a door all along. Fund it, he continued. All of it, 10% irrevocable. Autonomy for the foundation, quarterly transparency, public meetings. We rebuild Carter Industries under its umbrella and put profits into the rescue fund. We start with the names Mr. Carter has kept. The room reacted the way the sea does when the wind changes. Confusion, then a new pattern. Phones appeared, pens tried to keep up. A lawyer began drafting sentences with speed that proved he had already imagined this outcome and kept it hidden from the men who signed his checks. And one more thing, Richard said, voice rougher now, the surface scraped back to something human. He looked at Elijah. If you are willing, you won't come back as staff. You will come back as my daughter's tutor and as my partner in this. Teach her. Teach me. Teach this house. A blade of silence settled. It was not shock at the invitation. It was the room making room for what it did not have language for yet. Elijah held his gaze. Years passed between them in the sliver of time that eye contact can hold if both parties agree to be brave. I accept, he said. Emily let out a breath she had not known she was holding. The needle in the compass quivered and steadied, pointing not north but impossibly home. The Pimpton ballroom loved a crowd the way a stage loves light. Crystal dripped from the ceiling like captured rain. The floor was a lake of polish, de parquet, waiting to reflect whomever dared to cross it. A string quartet glided through something expensive. Waiters moved in patterns that said they had rehearsed being invisible until it became a second skin. People laughed a little louder than normal because pretending to belong is a noisy business. They turned when the trio came in, heads tilted first, then glasses. Richard in a tux that fit like an apology he had not learned to say yet. Emily in a navy dress with a hem she could run in. Elijah in a suit that had seen careful pressing and older days, the kind of fabric that refuses to lie about its age. The hush reached them before the stares did. Is that the janitor? Someone said, delight disguised as disbelief. Not anymore, another replied, and the second sentence hung between admiration and an itch to wound. Emily felt the room test them, the way cold water tests skin. She took Richard's hand the way a daughter does when she is leading her father somewhere he has never been. Elijah inclined his head to the quartet, and the cellist answered with a small smile that mattered more than the music. They began a circuit. Richard nodded to men who had toasted his worst instincts for years. Their eyes assessed and recalculated, minds measuring risk as if kindness were a stock they could short. A woman in pearls offered a laugh that cut. Richard, how brave, bringing your guest. My friend, he said, the word choosing him for once, and her smile faltered as if someone had switched the script without warning. Near the dais, photographs from charity galas past lined a table. 100 smiling faces pretended to be generosity, while 100 hands hid ledgers. Elijah paused at a frame he did not belong in and read the caption as if reading a headstone. Emily watched his profile and felt a heat in her chest that was not anger and not pride. It was something stirred. Ire, the feeling that comes